He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of two books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 29 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry. Today, we're going to continue the conversation in a new vein from last time. This time, we're going to address a more common situation where we've presented our creative to the client and the client has shot it down. But they're not asking us to rebrief. We simply go back to the well for new ideas. This is a challenge because it happens a lot more often than a rebriefing. In fact, we know from the research that it happens quite often. So the question is, what is the role of the creative brief writer or the strategist, which are often the same, to facilitate this process, to get the best work out of the creative team? What are your thoughts on that, Henry?
So, before we get in specifically into the role of the strategist, I want to agree with the premise that this tends to happen more often. What we talked about last week was a rare circumstance that does happen, and that's why I thought to do an episode on it, which is when you have to go back to the drawing board and write a new brief or modify the brief. This case, and for some clients, it's more common than others. In some client agency relationships, it's more common than others. And I'm particularly reminded of 15 years ago in my career, big fast food client, monthly calendar, flying to see the client once a week, to present creative. And when you have an assembly line like that, it can happen, right? That you brief, you go up there, you present, and they're not ready to buy anything that you presented. And in fact, when I got hired at that particular agency, that was one of the challenges they hired me to come resolve. Was it was creating stress on the agency and on the relationship between the agency and the client, because if you have to go back 2 or 3 weeks in a row to present creative, then what's going to happen is you're going to start infringing on the time that you're supposed to be ideating on the next initiative, because it's a fast moving industry and you have promotional windows that last basically a month. So it's really stressful when you have to go back and ideate against the same brief. And as a strategist, you may be sensitive because at some point you may feel, or creatives may feel, problem is a problem with the brief. Um, so I the key things, right, that a strategist can do is not get defensive about the brief, right? You don't want it to um, deteriorate into an adversarial relationship of, the Mexican standoff where everybody's like pointing, um, you know, guns at each other. That's not going to help. I think a big part of the strategist role, and frankly, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is both account service and strategy, is to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what the feedback was from the client, right? Like why they they rejected um the ideas. Now, this is going to be case specific, right? Some clients are really good at articulating feedback. Some clients, not so much. Sometimes they um, what they say and what they mean are two different things. Sometimes there's competing opinions in the client decision making, which makes it hard to decipher what the actual feedback was. So having alignment on that, I think internally, and being present for those conversations is something definitely a strategist should be doing. The second thing I think is, and by the way, I think it's up to account service to make sure that they get commitment from the client that that is exactly what was the problem with the creative work. Um, Another thing that, and it sounds a lot like we're very sensitive to the psychology of creatives in these two discussions that we're having. And there's a reason for that. And it's not because creatives are prima donnas. It's because they tend to be a little bit more sensitive, and when you're a creative person, this is your baby. So it's understanding that um, that psychology. Again, being a strategist, you have to be part psychologist, not just about the consumers and the target audience, but also about the clients and also with the creatives and the other stakeholders in the process.
Let me just
So,
jump in, Henry, and
yeah.
say that in my experience, it doesn't get easier for creatives as they get older and more experienced. I have certainly met and worked with young creatives who have a poise and a maturity that is surprising. And I've worked with senior creatives who have fuses that long, right? And
Mhm.
and get very frustrated when a client doesn't buy off. So I understand what you're talking about. It is a legitimate concern. Uh, but it is one that we as creatives have to learn to address. And also, just as a side point, it's I think sometimes presents an opportunity for creative to say, well, we had other ideas that you, meaning either account people or the creative director or the strategist didn't like, that we can now revisit. They might, although they might not, uh, be more they might be more spot on this time as we are hearing the comments and the feedback from the client. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just
No,
want to add that.
I agree. I agree completely. I mean, it might be an opportunity to go back to the well on ideas that were not presented to the
Mhm.
client, but were presented internally, and for whatever reason were left out. If the creative director's doing a good job, those ideas shouldn't be superior to the ones that were presented. But when you get into one of these situations, desperate times call for desperate measures. Now, related to that, I think a strategist can do, and again, this isn't a rebrief, but what provocations can uh, uh, a strategist bring that are related to that original brief? What new provocations or thought starters? But I like the idea of provocations, asking questions. It's like, why don't we treat it like this? Or why doesn't this situation with the consumer have this answer to it? Or, like bringing them some lateral thinking, some contrarian thinking. Maybe it's an opportunity for the strategist to have like one, I'm not I've one of my weak points as a strategist, frankly, has been leading brainstorms. Like that's not like that kind of game show host, like let's play a game thing to come up generate ideas isn't generally my bag. But I could see when, again, desperate times call for desperate measures, you might have to reach into that bag of tricks and lead a brainstorm, and bring some of these kind of lateral thinking and provocations um, to the table. Now, as a creative director, there are things that can be done as well, of course, which is maybe change up who's working on the assignment, right? Bring in some fresh blood that didn't work on the brief the first round, and inject them into the process either independently of the teams that are already working on it or as part of the team that is working on it, to get maybe it's shake up the ingredients a little bit to see if you get a different output or outcome.
Sometimes it's as simple as switching partners. If you have a copywriter and an art director who are partnered up, you want to switch them out with someone else, just so that it's the same. It's like bringing in a new team, but it still includes the people who are familiar with the project. They're just working with someone else.
It's a definite change of chemistry, right? Like
Yeah,
because no matter how comfortable and how great a relationship you have with your copywriting partner or your art directing partner, um, a change of pace can sometimes be surprisingly good for both. Um,
it's easier to do that with freelancers because they may or may not have a previous partnership relationship. When you have, art directors and copywriters who've been like old married couples, they might scream and bitch about being separated. But that's probably a sign that it's time for them to have some fresh opportunities. But you're absolutely right. The creative director needs to step in at this point. One of the things that I learned when I was a creative director is you have to let go of the work. You have to let your team do the work. But this is one of those times when, okay, if the ship hasn't sunk, but it's taking on water, you have to come in and bail out. So maybe you, as the creative director, have to offer up some ideas. If not the actual solution, what you just alluded to, which is brainstorming. Let's go down this direction and let's go down that direction and let's see where it takes us. And
You,
that usually stimulates the thinking.
you bring up an interesting point, and we may have talked about this ages ago, but a long time ago, early in my career, I read a piece about what the hallmarks of a great creative director are. And one of them was when the chips are down at the 11th hour, at the bottom of the ninth inning, losing by a run, he's got to be able to come up with the idea that saves the
Mm-hmm.
day. So you're right. It's not something he should be doing all the time. He shouldn't be pulling rank, injecting his ideas into the mix all the time. But there are occasions where he got to that position presumably because he was a brilliant creative. And occasionally he's going to have to dust off those tools and use them in the service of advancing the business, um, even if that's not technically at that point his role anymore. But it it's like having, Hank Aaron on the bench and not pinch hitting him at the end when you're down a run and with a man on base. You gotta let him. And so I think that's a great point.
I had the pleasure of seeing one such legend work in real time when I was at Team One Advertising. My partner and I were presenting some ideas for Air New Zealand, which was a new client that we had just taken on. And we were pretty happy with the ideas, but Tom Cordner, who was the executive creative director at Team One at the time, the one who wrote the original line for Lexus, the relentless pursuit of perfection, was reviewing our ideas. And the way you and I might just take a breath, he fixed one of our ideas that just blew us, my partner and I, just blew us away. And it was just fun. I wasn't at all offended. I wasn't going to argue with Tom Cordner because it was a better idea. But to sit in the presence of someone with that kind of a legendary status and see him do his work, and
Yeah,
he's an art director.
yeah.
He's not a writer. So that's kind of fun. And you're right. This is where the creative director needs to step in. Anything else you'd like to offer to brief writers, strategists, account folks, whoever happens to write the brief, when we have to go back to the well and redo the work?
Just to reiterate that you what you really don't want to do is devolve into a blame game. This is a moment to be magnanimous, and to encourage the creatives and not and recognize that there's a very real possibility that things can degenerate, and that's absolutely what you want to avoid at all costs.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.
Bye bye.